glad to have you here. So we'll now go into the presentation. This is the outline of our presentation. So we intend in the next about hour and a half to take you through a small background as to why we are here, and that's basically looking at the Finance Bill 2024 protest or dissent, what has now come to be popularly known as the Gen Z protests. So again, I think as I mentioned, the CLE program considered it useful to have a discussion on some of those critical economic and constitutional issues that have precipitated the sort of crisis that we have today. And our objective will basically be to unpack those underlying issues because just from our overview, we could see an intersection of law, economy, and constitutional rights, some sort of violations that we've seen in the over the past 2 or 3 weeks, and basically how the interplay of those factors has led to the public dissent that we've seen. So in terms of the outline, will provide that background, then provide an analysis of that summary of the problems that have led us here. And then we'll look at the policy context of the Finance Bill 2024. And that's in terms of the issues, the major issues with the bill. I think we can all agree that in terms of the substance, almost every Kenyan now understands, or because of the very wide discussion that has been held, a lot of people are very familiar with particular clauses, the suggestions that were made there. So we'll provide a summary of that policy context that created the issues that we saw. Then we'll discuss what we see as some of the significant fundamental constitutional issues, policy issues with regards to the institutional architecture of some of the main institutions that have been tasked in the formulation of budget policy, the finance bill, and what failures or what the current architecture has, how the current architecture of these institutions has caused us some of the problems that we see. Then we'll discuss the economic trends, basically an analysis of, again, the state of play with regards to some of the economic trends or the economic environment. And again, seeing whether some of the factors that have the economic factors that have led us to be where we are. And then finally, we'll have we'll make some conclusions given our analysis, and then we'll have your feedback after that. So we move to the next. Going into now the background, the background to the Finance Bill protests or the Gen Z protests, I think, as I mentioned, is pretty simple. And most of us are, if not all of us, are familiar with what has taken place over the last couple of weeks, I believe. So we've had public protests, and these protests have been driven primarily by the youth demographic. And not just youth, because I think the definition of youth under our constitution is persons under the age of 35. But these protests in particular have been driven by the youngest of the youth, which is now defined as the Gen Z part of the population, who are mostly, I believe, in their 20s and currently under 25. And the thing here is that most of them are visibly, this youthful population are visibly and justifiably frustrated with the current economic hardship and a failure in government policies. But the protests, much as the discussion has been that they are Gen Z protests, I think we can all agree that beyond the Gen Z, we have the largest part of the population we are expressed their frustration, and those protests have had the participation of larger than the Gen Z group. So they've been protests beyond that youth demographic and beyond any tribal or other affiliations. It's mostly a large population of segment of the Kenyan population who have been expressing their frustration with the current economic state of play. So then the protests were ignited. I think there has been frustration over some time, but they've been ignited by the very contentious Finance Bill 2024, which was interpreted as or seen as increasing the tax burden on the citizens. So I think over the last 2 years, beginning with the Finance Bill of last year, we had nationwide, not necessarily, we did have protests last year, but many Kenyans complained that the tax burden has become excessive, which was, of course, illustrated by the sharp increase in tax rates, different tax rates across the various tax heads. And given that we all know the first and the major implication of increased tax rates and the effect that it has on reducing the income or the amount that is available to persons for their own consumption. And I think here at the IEA, we have stated fundamentally that, that taxes are primarily first a claim on individuals or citizens' property. So the fact that we've had that increase in the tax burden has created we have seen, the implication has been the resistance, the very wide resistance that we have seen in people basically stating that for you to make that claim on our property, we must be in agreement or we must endorse some of those changes. So that finance bill has the now withdrawn finance bill led to that agitation that we have seen. And there have been some major issues that have aggravated that situation. We summarized them as three, beginning first with the high cost of living that has also been rising sharply. For a few years now, even before the COVID-19 crisis. Then we've also had high unemployment rates, which only serves to exacerbate the problem. And of these high unemployment rates, again, we see that the demographic that is mostly affected by this is the youth, with the constitution of that of the total unemployed being 68%, constituting the youth. So then we have, in addition to that problem, we also have seen a public perception of government mismanagement, and this is mismanagement of resources, mismanagement in terms of processes and procedures. So there have been many factors, an interaction of different factors that have all aggravated the frustration that we've seen. Then, so the protests have had different dynamics from what we've seen in the past, where protests were mainly called by politicians or different political parties. This time, I think we've had protests that were organized loosely, and with the organization and mobilization being done mostly by through social media. I mean, we are all aware of the hashtags that we've seen on the different social media platforms, with the major one being Reject Finance Bill 2024, that of course, was ended up being successful. What this did, or what this has done, is that widespread pressure. The protests have generated enormous pressure that then led to what we saw, forcing government to reconsider and actually withdraw the finance bill. But we're seeing from our assessment, we're seeing that in spite or despite that withdrawal, deeper concerns still remain. I think we've seen that even after the withdrawal, we still have some protests called to address additional issues, mostly looking at questions pertaining to governance and accountability. That's lack of accountability, mostly in leadership, state offices and officers, questions around corruption, and so on. So we still have deeper concerns that need to be addressed in addition to what we have, what we saw from the finance bill. And then I think in summary now in our summary of the problem, we've seen that the nature and the scale of these protests has demonstrated a rising political voice of Kenyan youth, and particularly the youngest among the in the population, calling for change, and hopefully generating. This should generate the conversations that we now hope to have. So that's the background of the Gen Z or the finance bill protests. So I think in discussing the background of you can already see some of the problems, but we summarized the main problematic issues or underlying issues that have created the situation that we have into the 7 that are summarized into on this slide. So the first one, and these are mostly constitutional issues, although we'll still come into look at this in greater detail, the first issue is we have seen a failure in the doctrine of separation of powers, contributing largely to the resistance, the public dissent that we've had with regards to the finance bill. What we mean by this, I think, so first of all, separation of powers is it's a doctrine under our constitution, and it's basically the principle that how the different powers of government should be divided or equally among the different branches, and that there should be adequate checks and balances between the 3 arms of government, with none executing or with none having more powers against the other, or controlling, with none controlling the other. So essentially, what it means is that the legislature or our parliament, the judiciary and the executive should be able to operate independently, both in terms of operational autonomy, financial autonomy, and so on, with none actually having, with no suggestion of overreach by any of the arms of the government. So now in our context here, why we say or why we see that we claim that there has been a failure in terms of the separation of powers is because we've seen members of parliament particularly being there has been a perception, real or not, that the Kenyan Parliament decisions are mostly informed by executive direction. And what I mean by this is that, so our members of parliament have been enacting laws, and particularly the finance bill, in a manner that suggests that they're not listening to the electorate, the persons who have elected them, but rather in alignment to what the executive has suggested as being their priorities, which of course does not reflect the priorities of the citizenry. So this has suggested an overreach or misuse of legislative power, which undermines obviously the checks and balances that are intended by the separation of powers doctrine. So ideally, in a system such as ours, where members of parliament are elected purely by the constituents and are supposed, the 3 functions of MPs being legislation, oversight, and representation, essentially, or ideally, they're supposed to consider the input that has been made by the public, and the laws that they enact should be reflective of the will of the majority. So when we have members of parliament actually claiming and stating that they have to be in agreement with a certain direction that has been stated by the executive, then obviously there's a blurred, the line between, in terms of separation of powers, becomes blurred, and it creates the problems that we have seen. So that's the first one. And so basically now what that has done is that now the lawmaking function, in terms of them enacting legislation, and in this regard, the the finance bill has been seen as being harmful to the priorities of the ordinary Kenyan. And I think we've all seen what that has done. Then the second problem in our assessment is, and these problems are all linked, is that we now see a trust deficit in leadership. So remember, we have national values and principles of governance that are listed under Article 10 of the Constitution of Kenya. And this should, among the things that are stated there, in addition to accountability, public participation, making sure that the voices of the people are represented in lawmaking, and failure to adherence to these values and principles of governance, of course, creates the trust deficit that we've seen in leadership. And what we mean by this, again, is that seemingly the public seems to have lost confidence in their leaders and also in institutions. I mean, I think we all saw what happened to Parliament, or the institution of Parliament. And it's basically a reflection that there is now increasingly a deficit of the trust that has been bestowed by the public in these offices. And so what it has done is that it has eroded public confidence in governance. It has created some sort of apathy and disillusionment, public disillusionment. And so when we saw the protests leading to storming of Parliament, I think it was also an indication of the people claiming that there's a clear deficit. We do not trust the leaders to make decisions that are beneficial to us, and members of the public trying to remind the legislators that, first of all, the exercise of all powers under the Constitution is a trust, and it's under Clause 1 of the Constitution, that power and that trust is donated by the public through the elections. So that's the second problem that we see. Then the third issue, and this will also be explained in greater detail under the economic analysis part by my colleague Leo, is the third problem is with regards to the debt crisis. So one of the things that has contributed or led us to be where we are here, of course, we all know the public debt situation in the country, that the growing deficits annually that have now reached a point where many have claimed that government has two options. So primarily they have been stating that the two options to this is either tax, and our executive and parliament's interpretation of either tax is tax excessively to recover that, or borrow. So the borrowing has been taking place over a number of years and growing. And despite various alerts from non-state actors that this was going to be a problem, I think the considerations were not done in good time. So it has created the crisis that we have here. And so I think for us, I think the third option that they have not discussed in detail, well, the leaders tell us that we have two options, either tax or borrow. I think there's a third option, of course, which is cut spending, leaving. I mean, the simplest way that has been stated by the Gen Z, stated very simply, rationalizing spending or cutting spending to reflect our current reality. So I think it's the most painful conversation that could be had at the moment. In addition, thinking about, without considering the other two options, I think there is a conversation that can be had in terms of reducing the expenditure or reducing the size of the budgets of the different arms of government. I think from our analysis, and it will be shown by Leo later, the greatest of the expenditure is done by the executive arm of government. So if any trimming is to be done, I think the largest part of it should be done under the executive, the budget that is available to the executive. So I think that's a conversation that many are not willing to have yet, but it could be a plausible that option. So that's the debt crisis. And the fourth issue that we summarized under our problems is with regards to performance or the underperformance of the labor markets in Kenya. So, and I think I talked about this while I was defining the summary of the context, the policy context. So here, the challenge is the formal sector in Kenya employs only about 3 million people out of a potential workforce of about 22 million, indicating a significant underemployment and a large informal sector. So this underperformance has led to, of course, various economic inefficiencies, and could also in some way have reduced, created some inefficiencies that have reduced the tax revenues that are available, and highlighted the need for job creation and better integration of the informal sector into the formal economy. So this underperformance of the labor market has basically led to the problem here has basically led to even the unemployment question that I talked about earlier, and led to aggravating the issues that we have at hand. So that's the fourth one. And then the fifth problem is on the effect of fiscal consolidation. So again, the government has been claiming to be undertaking fiscal consolidation over the past couple of years. And the effect of this has been, we have seen certain effects in terms of the efficiencies or inefficiencies in public service delivery. So while they have been stating that their aim is to reduce government, the deficit and debt accumulation through making certain cuts on spending and increasing taxes, I think the greatest effect has been seen in critical public service sectors, inefficiencies in healthcare provision, education, provision of various, for example, the transport networks, inefficiencies and the problems that we see there. And all these problems, again, together have led to or have increased the frustration that we've seen with the public sentiment being that while there have been these claims that we are trying to undertake fiscal consolidation, the public service, the effects, the very adverse effects are felt in terms of various inefficiencies with regards to public service delivery. So the government, in their sort of justification for this, is that there are limited resources to be able to provide efficient service delivery. I think just yesterday, in response to the now likely budget cuts that will, of course, result in from the withdrawal of the finance bill, I think we saw the judiciary already warning us in advance that we are likely to have even worse service or access to justice, facilitation of access to justice by the judiciary, because first of all, they also claimed that the recruitment of Court of Appeal judges that was supposed to take place commencing yesterday would not take place. I think they highlighted and before the public that there's a severe question of case backlog and what the recruitment of additional judges would have done in reduction of that. And basically what they're telling us is that while we have we are now all supposed to undertake this fiscal consolidation. You as the public will bear the brunt of it in terms of poor service delivery, because you can expect going forward that there'll be even greater delays at the Court of Appeal. And so this is across the board. So the judiciary stated that yesterday, and I think we are likely to see that, unfortunately, spreading across the other arms of government, and particularly even on the executive. We might see that or such declarations coming from other ministries, departments, and agencies. So that's the fifth issue. Then the sixth problem is with regards to kleptocracy and conspicuous spending. So what we mean here is kleptocracy is basically a form of corruption. So where government officials basically engage in rampant corruption and embezzlement of public funds. And the element of conspicuous spending here, what we mean is just the lavish kind of spending that we've seen by government officials, also done in an overtly visible way to the public for whatever reasons the state officials have for making that kind of public display of spending. So I think this has further led to increased frustration, where Kenyans, particularly the taxpayers, feel overburdened, and the fact that they see their leaders not spending the resources efficiently, but that conspicuous spending is sort of stated simply, rubbing it in the eye of Kenyans that we have access to a great amount of resources, and we spend it in a way that is not efficient. And so Kenyans' complaint now in response to this is they do not see they feel that increasing the burden of taxation, and while they know that their resources will be used subsequently in a manner that or increases corruption, or that will be spent only by a few within the leadership, I think has also only led to increased frustration by the members of the public. So it has also led to the question of eroding of public trust that we discussed previously. So that's the sixth problem. And then, so in summary, the totality of all the problems, these first six problems that we've seen, the convergence of all these issues, from the mismanagement of resources, to the debt crisis, to that trust deficit, to the questions with the problems with the separation of powers. I think now the convergence of these issues has created a sort of crisis in the equilibrium setting that has disrupted now the proper operation of governance, and it has basically led to this. These systematic issues have basically created a situation where government is unable to implement the policies effectively, maintain social order, and just made the whole situation worse than it was over the past 2 years or so. So that's a very elaborate summary of the problems. We go next to now looking at the finance bill 2024, there's policy context issues. So again, as I mentioned previously, we are all aware about what the provisions of that bill were. But what we intend to do with this slide is basically summarize again some of the problems that we see being generated by the finance bill, or the nature of our current finance bill. So here we have again 4 problems. So the first is that the finance bill in Kenya comes as an omnibus bill, and this is just to state that it combines an omnibus bill, usually just combines multiple amendments and provisions into one single bill. I mean, amending various different other laws and often covering a wide range of issues. And so this is a little problematic because Kenya's tax code has already been stated or is already perceived as being complex. So the very different amendments that are brought in by the omnibus bill only serves to increase the complexity of the tax code, making it hard for different stakeholders, particularly the public, and sometimes even members of parliament themselves, to scrutinize the clauses effectively. So it has too many clauses, usually that are being suggested as amendments to the different tax laws. I think in our summary of the now withdrawn finance bill of 2024, it had about 68 clauses and very many sub clauses. So looking at all these, the proposals or the raft of proposals that it seeks to amend are very many proposals, which again is opposite or which violates the what should actually be an ideal or a model tax code. A model tax law should be simple, predictable, and what we see with the annual tax bill is that the manner in which or the substance of the finance bill has often been problematic for these reasons. So that's the first problem. And it was also a problem very clearly with the 2024 finance bill. The second issue that we saw with the finance bill 2024 and also arose with the last year's finance bill is the question of public participation. So there were various issues, sometimes location issues, where the platforms for having that dialogue are suggested, sometimes places that are not accessible to the wider public. The period of public participation has been said in many instances to be, or has been seen as being insufficient. And then the question of what constitutes meaningful public participation, I think, is a discussion that has been had in this country for many years. I think since the promulgation of the Constitution, we've had serious questions almost annually on what constitutes meaningful public participation. And I think the fact that it has not been meaningful has also led to the resistance or the dissent the public dissent that we've seen this year. So then the other question with public participation has been the reasons that members of parliament have cited for either supporting or endorsing different clauses of the bill. So I think from our interpretation, the reasons that these MPs give us are basically a reflection of their priorities and their different policy perspectives. It was clear this year that some of the reasons that they gave were not aligned to the public's concerns, and this obviously suggests a disconnect between what the electorate would like and versus what their representatives are legislating. And that's, I mean, I think I already spoke about that question, the problem that we see with our parliament now enacting legislation that is purely out of their own interpretation of what should be the interest of the public as opposed to considering the actual feedback from the public. I think they've decided and suggested what should be the public priorities. Then the other issue that we have with the finance bill was the extent of the yearly revisions and the effect that this has had on public trust. I think I've already mentioned that it comes as an omnibus bill. We have the amendments being done annually, and the suggested proposals have usually been very extensive, and these frequent and extensive revisions together with the revisions of other financial regulations, only serve to create uncertainty and instability, which again is not in line with what a model tax law or a model tax code should be. So from our interpretation, we see that these regular major changes suggest that previous policies that were enacted were either ineffective or poorly designed. So we acknowledge that there is the public finance management law does state that while the estimates of the expenditure are presented, the minister in charge of finance or the cabinet secretary should also provide the proposals for how the revenues will be generated to match those expenditure. But our concern as the IEA is that we do not think that this should be interpreted to mean that there should be a wide range of unpredictable tax change proposals that are done yearly to finance the that expenditure. I think the proposals for revenue generation should be done in a manner that is predictable, and which I think we are now open. I mean, it's now the right time to have a conversation as to how those the presentation of those revenue generating measures should be done to avoid the kind of extensive changes that we've been seeing every year. And then lastly, I think it's just to reinforce what I've already said, that from our interpretation, we see no evidence or basis for the wide yearly or annual revisions. So yes, basically, I think there's an opportunity to rethink how that the provisions for revenue generated are presented to avoid making the kind of generating the kind of very large generic finance bill proposals that we saw this year. So that's the summary of the policy context. Then going to next. So I will try and summarize this very quickly because I've spent a significant amount of time talking about our analysis of these problems. But remember, as we mentioned in the title, we thought it was useful to try and unpack what are those major problems that have led us here. And that's why we've spent a significant amount of time looking at those issues. And some of them are already, I've already covered, but this chart just summarizes the issues again. So the constitutional issues is first we see there's a question of constitutional rights and economic freedoms. And the issue here is, as I stated earlier, that taxation is primarily a claim on an individual's property, and the fact that any tax measure that is proposed should be cognizant of the fact that it is leading to, or it has implications on the resources or the property that individuals have for their own welfare. So the kind of excessive taxation that we've seen has been in clear violation of some of the major economic freedoms, and the result is the resistance that we have seen. Then I think I've already spoken in great detail about the issue with regards to separation of powers. We do not see clear operational and functional autonomy of the three arms of government. The line is very blurred, particularly with regards to the legislative arm and the executive arm. There's also that separation of powers. We see it being a problem sometimes even with the judiciary when it comes to the question of allocation of resources. But for the context or for the discussion that we have here today, we see that major problem arising with the functioning of Kenya's parliament and with the legislative arm not being able to take decisions independently. Then the other issue that we have, constitutional issue that we have seen, is that there's the question of the rule of law, and that which basically means that all persons are equal before the law, and there should be equal application or equal obedience to the law, including court orders, obedience of court orders, and so on. So we've seen also quite a bit of public frustration with particularly the executive arm of government's disregard for the rule of law, and taking decisions that clearly show or are in violation of the law, and basically suggesting a high level of impunity. So I think those three issues, beyond, remember when I talked about that beyond the finance bill, we still, now the protests that have continued beyond that point to more underlying issues. I think those first three can be summarized here. And then the questions that we've seen with Parliament, the constitutional issues that we've seen with the institution of Kenya's Parliament. First of all, we all know and we acknowledge that the Constitution of Kenya gives Parliament the powers of the purse, or the powers of appropriation under Article 95 4B, which is basically the power to determine the allocation of how expenditure is done, allocation to different line items. So Parliament has this, the National Assembly has this power under Article 95 4B. But what we see subsequently, and again, connected to the issue of the separation of powers, we see that increasingly that Parliament seems to have abrogated its functions, and that's its functions in terms of making sure that the appropriations, or which is under its lawmaking function, is done only primarily guided by, that lawmaking function is done independently without influence, external influence. So Parliament has abrogated its functions, both in terms of lawmaking, again, in terms of representation, because obviously they're supposed to represent majorly the will of the people. And lastly, in terms of oversight, there are very many challenges or instances where we've had Parliament not taking its oversight function, particularly over the executive, not undertaking that function efficiently. And then the other problematic issue with the institution of Parliament is related to, again, the appropriations, is the question of earmarks. And here we mean earmarks in terms of funds that are particularly reserved as certain percentages to go to certain functions. So this is in contravention to proper lawmaking and proper resource allocation structures. So for instance, here we are talking about the Constituency Development Fund. So the earmark that has been done for the CDF as a minimum of 2.5% of the budget. We see this as being problematic, and has also aggravating the problem, because it has driven the need, or it has caused Parliament, the National Assembly, to be incentivized to have, or to make sure that there's a larger budget every year. Because obviously, if we have a certain percentage that is earmarked to go to the CDF, then the larger the overall budget, then the larger the specific allocated share that is available to the CDF. And so this has led them sometimes to make decisions that are advancing the executive's priorities, because the members of Parliament are actually incentivized, because they'll get more funds allocated to their individual constituency funds. So that has been a problem. Again, it's not anywhere within the core functions of our Parliament as the framers of our constitution intended it. They were supposed to have three primary roles, being legislation, oversight, and representation. So the question of development and MPs constructing classrooms and providing other public services, basically is them taking up functions that should be executed by other at the other arms of government, and also illustrating the inefficiencies of these other public services. So, for example, by them using the CDF fund to provide services that should be undertaken by the Ministry of Health or the Ministry of Education, and for them claiming that the CDF is more efficient in provision of those functions, calls us to actually question what's the challenge, what the greater challenge is, or what has occasioned those inefficiencies for the organs that are actually supposed to undertake the functions. Then the other question, of course, is now the legitimacy concerns that I've already discussed previously, because of the eroded public trust that members of the public have now claimed, that there's now a deficit in public trust of the legislators. We've had recently a call for recall that we may soon see some recall of members of parliament following the situation that we've just had. Then next, the issues, the other underlying issues with regards to now the executive. So these are political economy analysis issues. So from the way, if you look at our overall budget, I think if you look at the split between the budget, the split between the different arms of government and what claim they have on the overall budget, the executive, it's obviously very clear that the executive has the greatest hold on budget. They have they claim the majority of the budget. And the share of parliament and that of the judiciary is significantly small. I think the allocation that had been done previously, before the cuts that you are likely to see, the allocation that had been done to the judiciary was only about 24.5 billion. For parliament was about 45 or so billion. And then the remainder of 4 trillion budget is supposed to be implemented by the executive. So first of all, we see that the state, they hold the largest claim of that budget, and a significant part of this budget is in state corporations, some of whom we've seen performing dismally in the past, executing their functions inefficiently, and leading to great wastage and leakage of public funds. And then the other issue that we have seen with the executive hold on the budget, again, we've had a serious problem with the misprioritization. I think the largest conversation now, as we discuss austerity or fiscal consolidation, is the need to look at in greater detail what the largest portion of the budget has been going to fund, because while they have the largest share of the budget, we still have the issues with public service delivery that I've already talked about, meaning that the prioritization has not been efficient or reflective of the greatest need of the public. Then we have problems with regards to fiscal responsibility, fiscal discipline, and this is related to the fifth, where we see great wastage of public resources and graft and corruption. I think in the past, we've had a past president stating that from his estimation or from the figures that were provided to him, that the state possibly loses about 2 billion shillings annually to corruption and wastage. 2 billion shillings annually to corruption and wastage would translate to about 720 billion or greater than 720 billion annually in wastage, admitted by a previous head of state. And if this very contentious finance bill was only seeking to raise an additional 360 billion, and we are told now that there are two options, we either borrow or tax, I think there's a place for us to have a serious conversation on wastage of resources, because clearly our previous head of state had claimed that we could save over 700 billion from better prioritization, reduced wastage, and addressing questions of corruption. So I'll end my part of the presentation here, and I'll ask Leo to continue with the sections on failure in the institutions of parliament. Thanks, everyone.
The biggest issue that you notice is that Parliament is supposed to, which is the first in Kenya's constitutional architecture. Parliament is the first branch of, you'd say, of government, and they are the ones that they are supposed to constrain, constrain how constitutional powers are applied, and in doing so, that Parliament is supposed to now provide the entire checks and balances. But however, we see. And so, for example, one of the biggest policy events in Kenya is the budget. And in this case, finance bill that has become the issue of contention. You also, how members of the executive and also members of parliament struggled explaining either, for example, either expenditure proposals or tax proposals, especially tax proposals. And one member of parliament, in particular, the chair of finance committee in parliament, said the reason actually they're adding bread is to deal with diabetes. And we are asking ourselves questions, given the fact that as at the Institute of Economic Affairs, we interact with data, and one of that data is the KDHS, and what we know from the KDHS is that 20% of all Kenyan children are stunted. So and those are tax proposals. And the reason why we've now come to is that the institutions in parliament have actually failed, and they failed in a big way. Parliament is meant as an house of both rules, but essentially the house of evidence and facts. And so we've tried looking at other jurisdictions. So the PBO, one of the things that was supposed to help, and the IEA played a big role in its creation in 2007, was the Parliamentary Budget Office. And the PBO has imagined then, and still imagined now within our constitution in the presidential system, would, for example, provide evidence on why members of parliament should support for executive proposals or not. And we've looked at other jurisdictions, and the incentive structure in parliament, as Jackie has explained, first they have the earmark. The earmark is the CDF. And the CDF, our political economy analysis actually shows us that the CDF has actually had a problem, is now a slush fund for MPs. So we gave an example as being our institutions of parliament, and we've chosen one example, the PBO. If you compare it with the predecessor, there's in another jurisdiction, the Congressional Budget Office. A CBO is a congressional budget. The budget office is supposed to act as a referee between president and Congress, and in a system designed for conflict. However, if you look at the PBO, it's actually empowered to hold executive accountable. It's not an independent system, and Parliament determines the hiring. Parliament also determines resources, and also there is no bipartisan support for PBO to provide more independent and non-partisan analysis. And that's the problem, because Parliament cannot be able to see beyond issues. So the failure of institutions of Parliament. We've provided an example. If, for example, in economic analysis, from whether the revenue forecasting to tax expenditure analysis, to understanding distributional effects, what PBO should do, and that would be available in that. So we'll now start to focus on economic problems and state capacity issues. So one of the things that we notice is that looking at productivity diagnostics of Kenya's in Kenya, and in productivity, we looked at something we call the total factor productivity. Total factor productivity is that productivity or efficiency in an economy that is not either explained by capital or labor. So those efficiencies and basically that is how rules are done. So if you look at whether it's the capital stock, so if you look at the productivity between 2010 2014 and comparing 2015 and 2022 was lower. So the 2015-2022 was lower. And if you compare Kenya's productivity relative to Kenya's peers, Tanzania, South Africa, Malaysia, Nigeria, India, Ghana, uh, Ethiopia, and Bangladesh, you also see that it's in the mid range, but not in the top tier. And that in itself, productivity is total factor productivity is an important factor because it drives that private sector growth, private sector growth that is required for both jobs and also prosperity. The second issue that we also identify from the data is so there are two things. So there are wages when in any labor market there are always wages or earnings, and then but in the same economy there is also inflation. And if looking at now wages and accounting for those for that inflation, we'll actually realize that since 2019, real average earnings have never uh, earnings have never beaten inflation. And so if you look at so the and that growth has never is the only time it was positive 2.7% was in 2019. Ever since 2020, 21, 22, and 23. And that explains the economic pressures that Kenyan households and farms face on a day-to-day basis. And that has an effect on Kenyan families. And given that these pressures are real and the government as government with policy instruments, this is one area where resolution should have been obtained. Another issue is on the what we call economic deprivation. So the chance the chance to now be able to succeed in life. And if you look at the percentage, and this is data from Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, the inequality report, and now looking at both using the 2009 census and 2019 census. If you look at the economic deprivation countrywide, it has reduced. However, more than 50% in all categories, whether between the ages of 18 to 25%, 18 to 25 years, 26 to 34 years, and also 35 to 59 years, all of them are economically deprived. And that's a challenge. And that challenge, 50, when 50, there's a highly likelihood that 50% of all of all Kenyans in any category within their ages in the age of labor market, there's a 50%, 53% that they might likely be deprived. That more so, for example, that there are more people in Kenya who are likely not to succeed than those who are likely to succeed. That's a challenge, and that has implications for several other things. For example, like pensions, uh, dependency, families, healthcare, education, and many other things. And that's a very serious. This is serious. So it's a reality that pressure that what the agencies say you cannot escape the matrix. If you have heard about the matrix, it's real that there is a more likelihood that more people will not escape the matrix than those who will escape the matrix. Because if you look at 18 to 25 years, economic deprivation is 53.1%. So 47% are likely to succeed, but 53 are not likely to succeed. So that's a reality of our country, and that shows you that we are not likely a prosperous society like what we think. Another thing is on poverty incidence, and there are two things that we want to highlight. And this, I want just to use our chief executive's words. We want parliament and we want any policy maker. When you advance any economic policy decision, there are two indicators that you should never forget. One of them is overall poverty, which is the head count poverty, and also the food poverty. The other one, the hardcore poverty, which is now the most severe form of poverty, that one targeting can be applied, and there is you can apply that one targeting needs to be applied. But if you look at the whole number, for example, in 2015-16, that 6% of population at that time was overly poor. In 2021, 38.6%. But however, I need to raise a measurement question. That was 36% of a smaller population in 2015. Now, this is 38% of a bigger population. So what does that mean? The society became more poorer. And if you look at food poverty, 32% of a smaller population, 30.5 in 2021 of a larger population. In nominal numbers, that's still a larger number. And that's a real pressure. And if you look even at the population distribution, 71.6% of all of all population is in rural areas. So this poverty is not, and then the rest is in urban areas. Poverty numbers, even though severity might be bigger there are more prosperous people in urban areas than in rural areas. But the difference in terms of actual numbers, if you look at, or in terms of actual numbers, is so small that the overall society that we need, that Kenya, the economic policy should be more responsive to be able to lift a larger number of people. Like the entire, you would not say that prosperity is so significant in many other areas. Like for that to say that Kenya is a prosperous society, the differences are so small that only a smaller number of people are as prosperous, but the differences between the rest are not. Has explained a very important issue. Taxes are a claim on Article 40, the property rights. And when it's a claim on property rights, you realize that claims on property rights is a claim on economic liberty. And that's why, for us at the Institute of Economic Affairs, that's why we are not surprised at the agencies and the way they are reacting. We've seen in the last 3 years alone, we've seen petitions, memorandums growing from less than 60 written memorandums to more than 700 memorandums, and that shows that people are acutely more aware of what tax proposals do to the economic liberties. However, if you look at the overall score, this is an economic freedom index score, and it measures so many other things, including government size, rule of law, efficiency in markets, and issues related to trade, finance, labor, and other. It has more than 12 sub-indicators. Historical index, the change since 1995, Kenya has regressed to negative by negative 0.9. This is despite the fact that we've had a new constitution. So Kenya is still categorized in the mostly and free. We are actually 52.4%, which is closer to 50. 50 and below is in the repressed region, in the red region. If you look at the most important indicators from property rights, we are considered in the repressed region. Judicial effectiveness with the case backlog and all these other things, we are also considered in the repressed region. A very important indicator, government integrity, 31, considered in the repressed region. And in the fiscal health, 11.1. And the fiscal health is on the fiscal deficit, negative 7% for the past 3 years in constant numbers. So that shows you that the major indicators that are important for economic freedoms are in the repressed region, and that shows you that over time that these indicators start to show in the frustrations that Kenyans have, and especially the younger group. I've mentioned that I've been in the spaces. I've heard what most people say. How do we escape the matrix? And the matrix is it's that shell of poverty, and the way you escape it is through education, which is an important equalizer, but also jobs. If the economy is performing in a better more in a better way. So taxes being distortionary and looking now at economic freedoms, that is a confirmation of those of that frustrations on how distortions that tax rates create, but that taxes create, but generally on the claim that they are. We also discussed something on fragility. So, and this I want to use terms and economists do not use, but be used in political economy. This project called Kenya, whether most people believe in it, and we are looking at fragility in the fragility states FSI measures for main indicators: cohesion, economic, political, and social. And social, it's broader societal and external factors, demographics, whether refugees, level of external influence, political, state legitimacy and effectiveness in either public trust, services, rights, and law. Economic health and stability, decline, the inequality, and brain drain. And then obviously cohesion, the risk of internal conflict, whether it's elite fractionalization and group grievances. I want to say something about cohesion. It's important. This regime was elected on a very narrow margin. Actually, less than 200,000 votes. If we go by what the IBC, I don't want to go into the claim whether there was an election or not, but if we go by what the IBC provided, and they provided in court, so you would expect the big expectation here is that on cohesion, one of the things that, given that this was a narrow margin, that you would see more consensus and more persuasion in policy making, in how policy that is directed. And even importantly, Kenya's risk of debt distress changed from moderate to high in 2019. The IE has been speaking about these issues of public debt. And the reason why debt distress is an important indicator is because in times of debt distress, you need expenditure or revenue measures to go in one direction or the other, which means you have to persuade people. So that even it's a pain to see the president trying to explain and even mentioning something that is true about debt distress, but Kenyans cannot believe in him. And that's the thing. You don't squander the opportunity. You persuade people, and the way you persuade people is you explain, and the way you explain is by being transparent. And the way of being transparent is making sure that those proposals drive the maximum public welfare. So that if you are flying a private jet, that the constitutional value for money or the lawfulness is something that you have to convince people that what you are doing is the correct thing to show. So, and that's the thing, that cohesion is something that persuasion in the way policies advance is something that is important. Because of this reason, in the last 10 years, uh, uh, state fragility in Kenya has been falling and falling at an unprecedented rate. In the last 5 years, you've seen that it has lost, you lost 7 points in terms of that, in the way that index is created. And we are ranked 36th most fragile countries, the top 40 most fragile countries in the world. And that's the thing. And that's the problem. Like we the it means first the way the leadership has to be imagined and done and executed is in a different manner. But we still see comments that actually is the way you build state capacity is on the premise of public goods and meeting all those constitutional obligations. And when you meet all those constitutional obligations and you persuade people, and you persuade people, and you persuade the people of Kenya to believe in that project. And when you persuade them, it means it has to move away from just being words to actual policy. And that's the challenge that we see. So, and if you look at it, that's the problem that Kenya has with state fragility. So, for example, even on issues, one of the, in terms of the second issue on economic indicator, sub indicator for the state fragility is on brain drain. The idea is pro-migration because migration is a good economic policy. Either way, because that one allows public people to improve on that. But when the state promotes an economic policy, it has to be on the basis of what Kenyans. It has to be on the basis of evidence evidence and what Kenyans believe in. So as I wind up, the perception, Jackie has spoken about kleptocracy and conspicuous spending. Corruption was perceived is still we're still in the bottom half in the corruption perception index, and Kenya still perceives corruption as a greater challenge, and it's true. And the way the body starts with the anti-corruption fight, we first there are two things, there are three things we want to state. One, if you look at the corruption in Kenya, is no longer it's a problem of the fiscal leakage, like uh, budgets leaking directly because of one, either the way projects are managed, and two, directly through being lost through what we call people buying air, which is what we'd say a procurement. It's a problem of procurement fraud, but also a fiscal leakage. And a fiscal leakage is, for example, let me give one example. The Auditor General could not confirm the 67 billion was paid, given the data that she was provided and the audit evidence provided, 67 billion that was paid in form of pension could not be confirmed. And you see, that's a problem of fiscal leakage, and also a corruption, a procurement fraud problem. So it's a massive scale, and the way you deal with such kind of problem has to come from different perspectives. And what it could be, for example, it could mean either shrinking the state. It could mean several other things. So, like now, The state is a big employer in Kenya. One in every three employees in the formal sector is a is a public employee of the public. However, there are many other state agencies, for example, including the Teacher Service Commission, including various state agencies, parastatals, and others, where the numbers that have been placed forward that are considered uh, that people are being considered being paid have never and are in doubt. Are in doubt. In 2018, the then President Kenyatta launched a program for police by using biometric, ensuring that each and every police officer. The president announced then that 150 million shillings in wages had been saved every month. So the question is, and we've seen other counties, when the counties undertook head count exercises, they're able to weed out cost workers, which is so fiscal leakages is not just in goods and services alone. It's no longer goods and services. It's also in ghost workers. It's also in other places. And the way the corruption problem is needs to be reimagined in a better way. So, for example, another issue that we really need to highlight is when the Treasury CS spoke about investments in state corporations. And I want to give context. State corporations uh, as are actually responsible for more than 60% of all pending bills at the moment. But the CS spoke about that the investments, they've calculated the return on investment, it's 0.13 for the investments that the public make in state corporations. So those are not just simple things that needs discussion, but significant problems that need to be dealt with. So as we wind up, what are some of the critical things that we see? Too many balls being dropped off, uh, falling straight fragility. Uh, there is need to be more persuasion and consensus building in policy. And then the constitutional crisis now. So people normally say the president is the backstops of the president, but there's a different perspective here. In terms of budgets, the powers of the past, in terms of in making sure that whether it's the principles of public service, whether it's at values of Article 10, whether it's the leadership and integrity, whether it's any constitutional provision, Parliament is the leader. And when Parliament fails in a bigger way that the way we see it now, the effectiveness of Parliament has been undermined, and Parliament is now like a fringe of a part of the executive. That's a challenge that you will end up with a result where people want to ban Parliament, and that's the challenge. Secondly, the place of judicial oversight. You see and see more cases coming up. For example, like the previous finance bill, a finding is made by the judges that there's a constitutional arm on the housing levy. But again, they say we've established that there's a constitutional arm, but there is the executive can continue to collect money until they amend that law in after 45 days. That's frivolous. And that's the place of judicial oversight. That's the reason why Article 165 provides the High Court for them to seize any matter uh, in any issue. Like there is no limit. But the thing is that we see is there is more difference to the state. You've seen more judgments, and I know there are more lawyers on this call. You've seen more judgments saying allow the executive, allow the attorney general to submit a bill, allow the leader majority to do this, allow this. So the place of judicial oversight has to come out strongly. People have to see that the courts provide that reprieve that the Constitution provides for. And the state and any other person are treated equally when they go before courts. And then the last part is reimagining the powers of constitutional commissions. One of them is the EACC. EACC needs to shake off the tag that uh, they only punish small fish in the sea, but deal and then be able to deal with the larger with the larger fish. And the way you deal with the larger fish is getting cases. Because, for example, even if you arrest, let me give an example. So we've been studying this economics of corruption, and one of the things that you realize is that corruption can be centralized or decentralized. Somebody cutting away 5 billion shillings and police officers receiving 550, 100. By the time the decentralized corruption becomes a billion shillings, that's greater effort that had been put in place. And it's easy to distract. But the one that is bad is one person walking away with a check of 5 billion shillings, like just in a snap. That one is difficult to correct. So the ESCC needs to think and think in a better mechanism, in a different mechanism. The Independent Police Oversight Authority, the IPOA, the Ombudsman, all these other agencies. So, for example, the complaints of in other jurisdictions, I'm forgetting. I think either it's Peru or one of these countries. The president was seen with watches, exotic watches, luxury watches, Rolexes and the others. And it triggered an investigation leading to that presidential or the palace being raided and for evidence and that kind of a thing. I'm just giving an example that the commissions need to see this beyond a smaller, just one part, one perspective. Thank you so much for questions. Back for questions and answers now.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Leo. So, I mean, I think we'll now go directly to the plenary. Thanks a lot to all of you who've stayed with us for the duration of the call so far. As I stated earlier, that we intended for this to be a conversation. So we very much welcome your input, your additions. We do not claim to have all the answers. So it would also be useful to hear from you what your perception is on some of the critical issues that we've raised, both on the constitutional and legal issues, as well as the economic analysis that has been provided here by Leo. So I'll welcome anyone who has a question. Please raise your hand. I'll see it and we'll give you a chance to ask a question or to contribute make a comment. And then, but before you do that, I think we can start with the questions that are here. So there's a long, elaborate question here by Daisy. So Daisy asks, the Constitution in Article 2 states that no person may claim or exercise state authority except as authorized under the Constitution. And further in 3.2 states any attempt to establish a government otherwise than in compliance with the Constitution is unlawful. So given that the 13th Parliament from the onset is not constitutionally composed for their failure to adhere to Article 27.8, can all that they have done thus far be voided on such grounds? And I ask this because it is clear that, as you stated in the first part of the presentation, that among some to the issues is that some of the issues that Parliament is not seen as serving the interests of the people, despite it being a house of representation, and it is more about advancing the interests of personalities, the executive and MPs, including continuing with budgeting and disbursements of CDF, among other issues. So that is the first question. So I will respond to that, and then as well as Leo can also add. Then Ivy, I expect that the slide you're referring to was the one on the poverty numbers. So there's a question that what is driving food poverty? Leo, this is for you. What is driving food poverty given that agriculture is the mainstay of our economy and we are largely an agrarian country? Okay, so that's the second question. Then there's a question here by Esther that the independence of parliament cannot be achieved where the ruling party controls the majority in the House. Even in the devolved system, legislatures exist to rubber stamp executive orders. So this is not necessarily a question. I think it's a statement of her observation. And then Ivy says that if the inputs that go into farming are expensive, then it becomes harder. Fake fertilizer does not help. So thanks, Michelle, for sharing the presentation. So I don't know if there's any hand. Sorry. I don't see any hand yet. But as you prepare your questions, so Daisy, if I start with what you've stated with regards to the calling into question the legitimacy of Parliament and its decisions based, first of all, on its composition, I think I would agree that, first of all, yes, there are serious non-compliance issues. Our legislative houses have been in breach of the constitution by failing repeatedly. All the houses that have been elected since the promulgation of the constitution had the obligation to implement the two-thirds gender rule, and they have clearly been in violation of that, which of course only calls into more question the legitimacy of those houses and of their decisions. I think we are all aware of the advisory that was issued in 2020 by the former Chief Justice, David Maraga, when he advised the former president to dissolve Parliament in line with Article 261 of the Constitution. So if you remember at the time, that advisory was made following 6 petitions for the dissolution of the House. There had been several court orders that were compelling Parliament to enact the legislation, but they have time and again failed to do so. And if I use the words of CJ Maraga at the time, he said in his advisory that Parliament had blatantly failed, refused, and or neglected, to implement that principle. And for that reason, in his view, in his considered view, the House should have been disbanded at the time. And he obviously acknowledged that it could be a painful decision to disband the House in terms of the consequences to the taxpayer then. Of course, we did not have the House being disbanded, but I think I would have to agree with the CJ and his advisory that, and we have seen the consequent implications of continued non-compliance with different constitutional requirements by the legislative arm of the legislative mostly and executive arms of government, the violation of the rule of law that we have discussed. And so the implications is now continually what we are seeing. Increasingly, we now have the public being more aware and wanting to contribute more to the discussions and calling for serious action even against Parliament. And I think with time, if the trend that we are seeing now continues, we will have even more agitation for serious action when Parliament is in violation of constitutional requirements or constitutional principles. So this may just be, again, one of the things going forward that should be an essential part of the conversation for what should be done going forward and for Parliament's role. And I mean, I think my response here would be that I think the Chief Justice at the time was right in calling for the dissolution of the House. The part on their decisions being, all their decisions since then being invalid, I think it's a question that we can discuss. So first of all, they're illegally constituted. That we all agree. I mean, there's a place of judicial review for different actions taken by state offices. But where do you even begin to subject those decisions to judicial review if it was if the decisions were made, first of all, by an illegally constituted body. So, I mean, I think it's a conversation for all of us to have, but that would be my initial quick feedback. Then to Ivy's sentiment executive influence, where she has stated that, I mean, it's common practice that it seems to be common practice that where the composition of the House is the ruling party has the majority of leadership in parliament, then the legislative arms remains a rubber stamping, sort of just a rubber stamping procedure of executive action. So again, I think I also agree with that sentiment. It seemingly I can agree with that sentiment, but the difference here is I think maybe for us, we should have a deeper conversation on looking at some of the institutional safeguards that we can implement going forward, particularly looking for the legislative arm for parliament. So a conversation on after, if certain decisions have been proposed by the electorate after public participation, first of all, how should decisions be informed? What's the place of public participation in informing decisions? They should illustrate to us, following public participation, regardless of what the executive position is, legislators should be able or should be in a position to take decisions that are in the best interest of the people. If there are certain safeguards, in addition to what the Constitution has already provided, that should be put in place, then we can discuss that and the mechanism for the implementation. But I think our Constitution at best provided it's a good attempt at creating the autonomy of the different arms of the different arms of government, and even by parliament taking decisions continuously that just advance the executive's interest is still a violation of what the constitution has provided. As it is, there already are certain safeguards to ensure the operational and functional autonomy of the parliament, including them having the appropriations function and powers, but they clearly seem to be an abrogation of those functions. So I think, again, it's time for us to have a discussion on what additional things could be done to better implement this. So that's my quick response to those first two statements. So Leo, you can respond before I ask Daisy. I see Daisy's hand is up, but Leo.
Yes, so to respond to the question on what is driving food poverty, we want to, so the food poverty or food, what people call in Kenya food insecurity or that kind of thing, is not a supply problem. It's an income problem. It's not a supply side problem. It's a demand side problem. It's an income problem. You plug into the food market uh, through income, because once you have income, you can buy sugar, you can buy rice, you can buy all forms of protein, whether it's the butchery, all that kind of a thing. It's not what you produce. And we really need to demonstrate that, because this is something that Amartya Sen won a Nobel Prize for more than 20 years ago. And he won a Nobel Prize because, as a Bengali, he used to make an observation that when there was drought, or when there was floods and people couldn't go to work, there was a famine. And most Bengalis at that time, you would work in the rice paddies, where those. So and so that's the thing. It's not about the amount of food you produce. It's not like that. There are so many other countries with wheat with cereal surplus, like India, but 300 million people out of close to 1.4 billion go to bed hungry. So it's not like that. We really need to move away, and it's an income side problem. It's a and the reason partly even you hear what was on the spaces is on the spaces is dignity. Like the big problem in Kenya is government policies do not revolve around dignity, and the way it is you there's a famine, you get a minister flies there, and this is a continuous thing. This is not just for this administration, even the previous administrations since the independence. A minister would get there, you get a small tin of cooking oil for korogoros. You know what a korogoro is, like the tin of maize, some beans, and that is it. And that is not even what. So food security is not a supply side problem. I really want to emphasize that because that is something that among the first things I learned when I started working professionally as an economist, that when Kwame shared a paper on Amartya Sen's paper and the way he explains, and it's not an supply side. Even actually, in amongst those papers that when Amartya Sen wrote the paper on food security, um, he observed that some countries in Africa, their food per capita increased, but that one did not do away with famines. So we really need to understand. On the one of the constitutional provision of two-thirds, of two-thirds, that is not something we can even, we need to explain. The idea is that there was a process that was done up to, so you'd expect that Parliament by now would have prioritized the bill and it would be in the House for the constitutional bill for them to be able to undertake that. But sadly, just like in many other Kenyan thing, the multi-sectoral on two-thirds gender would end wanted they wanted to hand it up with many other constitutional amendments so that it can be subjected to a referendum. And we don't think that Kenyans at present are currently prepared to expand government. So I just a constitutional bill through a parliamentary rule would have cured that problem. So I would have cured the and be able to deal with the problem. But as it is true that the parliament is not constituted properly. On the independence of parliament, you see, and this is where we bring a different kind of thinking. The problem is not majority party. The problem is it's it's the in parliament is a set of rules. There is the constitutional commission, then there is the budget office, the other things. And if you look at the configuration of how budget offices are configured, uh, for example, if parliament wrote rules, uh, uh, 10 rules on how tax policy proposals should be written, one of them being that there should be evidence on the basis of that revision. It will solve most problems that we have with the finance bill. Because most of the problems with finance bill, there is no logic and there is no evidence. Like whether, for example, do we still keep the RMLF and have that as a circulation tax, or we have a motor vehicle tax? Like there are things that you even see within the finance bill that contradict each other. So if Parliament was able to write a rule and say a tax proposal can be brought into this house if there's evidence on how the regulatory impact assessment, how it will affect the demand and how it affect where is the elasticity and that kind of thing. That will solve half of the problems that we have in the finance. But the way, so it's institutions of parliament. If we have a working budget office similar to the budget office in the US, or we have like it's not just we have committees the way committees take evidence, the way committees process information, uh, meaningful public participation. If you have 47 counties and you cluster them in form of like 12 or 15 counties, you're able to undertake a more robust public participation. So there is a challenge with the way institution of parliament is set up. We are not just saying it's a political problem of majority or minority. Sometimes even parliament actually, both majority and minority, like on CDF, they agree CDF for them is a bipartisan issue. So we should not categorize it in just political and there's the way the parliament has failed. Back to you, Jackie, for I've seen more answers.
Yeah, yes, thanks, Leo, and thanks for the questions so far. So I have 3 questions, and I'll go in the order in which they were asked. So I'll begin with you, Daisy. Please unmute yourself and ask or your question or make your comment. Okay, so before Daisy gets back, I'll go to you, Mushai. I see your hand is up. Please unmute yourself and ask your question or comment. Oh, wait, Daisy, are you here? Sorry.
Yes, I am. I was having trouble unmuting. Can you hear me?
Yes, sorry, Mushai, just hold on. Yes, Daisy, please proceed.
Thank you very much. And thank you so much for this presentation. I mean, I think it's very eye-opening, but it's also very heartbreaking, you know, to see just how badly the nation has fallen. And you did say that we have to have a conversation about what needs to be done. And that is exactly what I want to ask, is what is to be done? Because Parliament has failed totally in the application of the principles of public finance. I mean, on every single principle as established, Parliament has failed. You know, and right now, with the president now saying, and given that the bulk of the budget actually goes to the executive, why should the other arms, particularly the judiciary and county governments, have to suffer cuts when the bulk of the money has actually been consumed at the executive level, and mainly on duplication of roles and unnecessary expenditure? So how can we tackle that, you know, to be able to stem, because it will definitely, when you look at even that communication that came from Treasury, the areas that they want to deny funding to goes to service delivery, social services. Yet we have not quite heard. I mean, you're telling us you're cutting funding to the office of the, it was in the first place. So how do exactly can be done? Even in terms of, because a rogue parliament, I mean, short of having it, is something I think a campaign that we should very seriously consider. I don't know the conversation and you, Jackie, but what exactly can we do that is meaningful? Because I think that the Gen Z demonstrations, as they've been.
Sorry, I think, Daisy, you're breaking. I think Daisy was breaking towards the end. Daisy, you're still here. I think you were breaking towards the end, but I think we've gotten largely your question in terms of what can be done. And I'll also, as before I invite the other colleagues, I'll also mention that I'll also request some of my colleagues present here to make their inputs in response to some of the questions here, because it's we're encouraging a conversation. But before I come to that, I'll ask Mushai, welcome Mushai, to ask your question or make the comments that you have.
Thanks, Jackie, and thanks for the presentation. Very interesting and timely conversation. I think the Bible says the debtor is always a slave to the lender. To what extent is this crisis driven by the demands that our creditors have put on us? And I suppose that's also on our way forward because we are not necessarily going to be able to meet those demands. I think the IMF had a staff level agreement recently, and they're supposed to have is it a board approval next week? And we don't know what's going to happen around that. And what are the consequences to that?
Sorry, thanks, Mushai. We'll go to, I think I have one more hand. Lillian. Lillian, please unmute yourself and ask your question or comment.
Thank you, Jacqueline. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, okay.
So my question is with regard to the cuts that the government is speaking of and what, of course, as a nation we expect. But realistically speaking, and IEA being the economist and dealing with all the data, is it, even if we cut back, is it possible that the budget cuts will have such a huge impact on our spending, or rather on our budget? Sorry, will the budget cuts have a huge impact, or is it one of those things that we might just do, of course, there's what we do to show there's goodwill from the government, but when we look at the numbers, will they really have an impact? And where exactly are we having these budget cuts? And now that we keep saying that the finance bill would have provided an additional 346 billion, we don't have that now. That is what the government is saying, and talking about that we'll have to borrow more. So we all know that in the past, we've not even achieved the revenue targets that have been set before. So realistically would not have even hit the 346 billion. So when we're talking about budget cuts from your side, will they have a huge impact, or we will still just have to go the loan way? We'll have to get more debt.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot, Lillian. So there's another question. So Benedictus, I see your hand up. Please ask your question. Unmute yourself and ask a question.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, slightly.
Just a
Maybe.
quick one.
Uh-huh.
Discussion is insightful. Really concern me. As the institute, how do you get this information? In Parliament,
Sorry, it's not very clear. I'm sorry, Benedictus. It's not. Can you maybe move? I don't know whether you should move closer to your mic, or your voice sounds a little muffled. I'm sorry. Please go again. Yes.
Is it better now?
Yes, it is much better.
Okay, so my question was, the discussion has been insightful and I have learned a lot, but my concern is really how do we get this information to get to the decision makers who will utilize this information and make real decisions? Because then without that, it's just another talk show. So, but that's where my interest is. How do we bring this information to the decision makers? Because if you look at the data you're presenting, it is reasonable, it's logical, it's sensible. So how do we get that to the decision makers? Thanks.
All right. Thanks to all of you who've raised questions so far. I think there was one more question in the chat box, or two actually. So there's a question from Kwame. Thanks. My claim is that the protests that we see are about Kenyans questioning the size of the state. Do you agree? Okay. And then Utalii Youth Organization. My name is Tivin from Utalii Youth. My question was in line with Daisy. The problem we are fighting is in the executive spending. I think that's more of a statement. So I'll ask Leo to respond first. But even as we respond to some of the questions, I'll also call Kwame to contribute to the discussion, particularly with regards to Daisy's question on essentially after a rogue parliament. what are your views? I think the participants here would also be interested to hear some of your views on what you think should be done, and then also what are we also in response to Mushai's question on the lenders, us being beholden to our lenders, and what implications that have, and the way forward. So I'll ask you to respond to those two after Leo. I'll request you to respond to those two after Leo. So Leo, please go first.
Yeah. So the question by on also the question by Mushai on the obligations. My perspective is on two issues. Is two-pronged. Like one, there's the question about the IMF statutory benchmark on primary. What should be the primary balance? And most people say it's the primary balance is too small. However, see, we've read the IMF evaluation from the first time the program was launched to the now the comments in the seventh review, all the way from the first, second, third, and fourth and fifth and sixth. If you look at, so for example, like if you look at some of the things that government of Kenya committed, the only thing that they was committed was on the primary balance. But the commitment on the primary balance is on two ways. One, you either deal with the expenditure problem. You deal with the expenditure problem, which is you cut the expenditure, or you raise revenues. And the IMF program had a reform package, and that reform package is so. For example, out of the 240 something allowances, the government of Kenya committed to bring that number to a reasonable number, which was, most people said it was 6. If you look at state corporations, government of Kenya committed to dealing with the statutory problem of state corporations. And even the first program had an analysis focusing on 3 state institutions that whose liabilities and risks was significant on the fiscal framework. But you see, the big issue is since that first review, the reforms were clawed back. Like on the allowances, we've held, and the IA, we've attended actually all wage bill conferences, But we've seen instead of the problem of the allowances being dealt with the savings, you don't see those reforms. And on that basis, because the savings that were supposed to be made were not just to be made on one side. There were no cuts to be made on one side. The cuts were to be made from state parastatals to wages and to the wages, all these things, dealing with procurement fraud, dealing with anti-money laundering, so the IMF package and the way we understood it, and through reading the text and all the statutory benchmarks, it was on the basis of you are going to deal with all these reforms that will give you an additional fiscal space of something between 400 to 600 billion. And once you get the growth, if this had been done in 21, once the economy expands, that will give you time now to deal with the issue of the debt crisis. And that could mean, and the IMF program the support was not just on the fiscal policy side, but was also on the money, because Kenya, the debt crisis that Kenya has an element of what we call the balance of payments. So that also it was affecting the balance of payments. So there was a program on the balance of payments, which could mean, for example, letting the shilling float on its natural waters and finding its true value. And given the fact that there were steps in place to be able to deal with that. So the reform package needs to be understood as a whole thing. And our assessment of the and Kwame will give more detail on this. Is it was not it's not something that was difficult to achieve. However, that thing was not something that was dealt with. On the question of what Daisy and Lillian asked on the budget cuts, the assessment is Parliament has to consider budget cuts and they have to give their own input. We don't defer to Treasury's perspective by saying that the budget cuts will be like this on this basis. We've seen the disclosure by the GSC yesterday that they are suspending the hiring of Court of Appeal judges on the basis that Treasury asked them to undertake budget cuts up to 15%. The evaluation, Kenya is on a program-based budget, and the program-based budget is you evaluate program by program. You are not cutting arbitrarily on an arbitrary basis, so you cannot say, for example, you will have a fiscal framework in place of close to 4 trillion shillings, and if you cut back to 3.6 and fail to provide for vaccines, definitely that will be another recipe for disaster. So the fiscal framework is on the basis of meeting those public goods and those constitutional obligations. You cannot say when the Constitution says free and compulsory basic education, then you start to say. So the idea around budget cuts is not, and that the idea will strongly give the perspective before Parliament is Kenya is on a program-based budget, and those cuts should be on the basis of urgency, and the urgency is something that has already been committed to in the Constitution and in the public goods. And then the other things now, whether, for example, in peace travel, there's foreign travel, or people can be paid allowances, those are things that can be determined later, but they are things that are already fixed in place. So we'll see, look, we don't defer to National Treasury because we know the constitutional power, whether it's, we know that the constitutional power, Parliament determines form, timing, and content of the budget. So we don't defer to what Treasury say because Treasuries are just suggestions, just like the way me and you can make just suggestions. Even still, because we are no longer in the Westminster model, where Treasury's perspective in fiscal framework were things. On the Kwame's question on the size of the state, it's true. Kenyans uh, 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 and Kwame, I'd like that this is something we can tell our audience, the discussion that we had on what we've now agreed that Kenyans agree on what is democracy, and secondly, on the issue of the market, but on the issue of market. But on the state, they agree. Kenyans even saw that on that day, people were saying, why should that the state should be cut back? Why should we even? There was even a coherent message on whether we should even have CDF in place. So why should we line up? Why should a parent and a student line up for 12 hours, for 6 hours under the sun, to wait for an MP to give them CDF if education can be provided for directly? Like there was a very coherent message. They even forced the president actually to repudiate some of the offices in the office of the president, like the office of the spouse of the second of the deputy president, and also the office of the first lady, amongst other things, whether we should have an office of intercessors and the rest. So Kenyans, there is still a serious clamor on whether a public office, some of the public offices, even the office of the Prime Cabinet Secretary, amongst other public offices. And that's a very important perspective that for the first time we are seeing that through a protest, some of the critical things that we've been calling for, that the size of the state should be on the basis of what Kenyans can buy for and buy for in both for value for money. So that's a very important thing, and the questions that they came were very intelligent because they can see and they see the constitutional premise saying what value does this office bring, and why should we fund offices, for example, that are not part of the constitution? Those are that's not just that's not just ordinary political talk, but also very important, very important aspect. So we agree on the last thing. We agree. Executive is an holder of the budget. It owns most of the resources. Actually, if you use the audited value of last year, you use last year's budget, counties even get less than 15%. The big issue now, and where most of the cuts should come from, is in the executive branch, and there are many other things. Like if you look, there are things that the state provides for, like the airline business that the state supports and even gives direct cash transfers, direct budget support, and that kind of a thing. They even changed aviation policy to become that farm's to reflect the realities of that farm. While some of those things that they're providing for, the spare parts, the leasing agreements, all those things that are already in are so huge that even if Kenya Airways was to run full flights throughout the year, they'll be never able to recoup those costs. So those are some of the things that need discussion, and there's a big discussion that really needs to happen on, for example, whether we should keep some of those farms or not, because most of them are pork barrels, most of them are slash funds for the executive. And if you heard what the NCs were talking about, they're saying we want things that are critical. We want things that are critical. If it's healthcare, if it's education, there are things that they formed consensus on, and those are goods with positive positive spillovers, and that will play a big role in making the Kenyan economy better. But if you look at what the state currently provides as it is, some of those goods are things that should never even be the priority of the state. And that's why we made a discussion on, we even had a webinar on the privatization. Should have been a big issue, because once you cut those funds loose, you don't provide budget support and you don't pay for those employees. And you also don't, some of those liabilities, you don't actually pay for them. So I want to end at that, back, Jackie, so that Kwame can introduce.
Yeah, thanks, Leo. Sorry, just before I invite Kwame, I'd also like to make some quick input to some of the questions. So I agree with the sentiments of Leo in terms of the question on the budget cuts. So Daisy's question, in light of rogue parliament, what should be done because parliament have clearly or seemingly failed us. So I think I know we all have heard about the opportunity we have in making a better decision in 2027. But of course, the Constitution predicted the likelihood, also the likelihood of us having rogue members of parliament in advance. And so Article 104 on the right of recall preempts the situation and allows us the right to recall a member of parliament before the end of the term of the relevant house in accordance to Articles 97 and 98. I know that the procedure is not easy and would likely face some hurdles, but I think it's one of the options, the recalling of individual members of parliament, the continued exercising of the rights and for assembly, demonstration, picketing, and petitioning parliament to make better decisions that are in line with the will of the representative, the people, the electorate. We also have the opportunity to petition against various decisions made by the parliament that are in breach of the constitution through the court system. That's why we have the opportunity, the separation of powers is supposed to provide a check for this, so that when Parliament goes out of order, then we have another branch and being able to keep it in check. So those are just some of the ways, and I'll ask Kwame later to add to this. Then your question on the cuts, I also agree with you that it's actually very unfair that the first proposal that the head of state had in response to reorganizing the budget after the withdrawal of the finance bill was to state that the cuts would apply primarily to the judiciary, who, remember, only claim was 24, the allocation was only 24.5 billion. That's the judiciary plus the JSC. The judiciary alone was 23 point something billion, the 900 million for the JSC. So the fact that the first place that the head of state claims will undergo or will have to yield some cuts as the judiciary, excuse me, I think is a demonstration of lack of the goodwill in supporting the independence and the proper effective functioning of the judiciary as an arm of government. It's not a demonstration of goodwill. The other one is, excuse me, the other one is on the counties, also claiming that we should expect that the funding going to counties will also receive a significant cut. Again, I think it's still a demonstration of lack of goodwill. As Leo said, the first part for controlling where we should think about rationalizing the budget and think about the very rampant wastage is in the executive branch of government. Let's look at the double allowances that are paid, the duplication of roles, as you rightfully put it, the issue of ghost workers. Let's do a proper payroll audit and check for fraud with regards to hiring of personnel. So on the wages part, to what extent have we been having fraudulent payments being made? Then to add to my voice to what the response that has been given to Moshai's question, to what extent is the crisis driven by the demands by our lenders? I do not think, in my view, I do not think that this crisis has been driven by our lenders. We created this crisis by ourselves, and primarily the first person that should be blamed. This crisis has been driven by our members of parliament for failing to audit the debt, our total debt structure, for approving time and again the total public debt without making any questions, sometimes without even knowing what exactly they are approving. I think we've had those discussions here in the past that sometimes members of parliament have given approvals for raising or incurring debt without knowing exactly what they're approving. So that failure, again, by parliament has been the main driver. The IMF and the World Bank have only illustrated it to us and it's just, we have to be in adherence to their requirements to receive the funding that we do. So that's my personal opinion, and then Kwame will add to that in addition to what Leo said. I think then on Benedicta's question on how do we get this information to the decision makers, I think this finance bill / Gen Z protests have shown us, first of all, a very fundamental way of getting them to listen in spite of some of what we have seen previously as arrogance. The citizens exercising of their rights under Article 37, remembering that we all have the right to present. Every person has the right to peaceably and unarmed assemble, demonstrate, picket, and present petitions to public authorities. We've seen the presenting, the exercise of this right leading to withdrawal of some contentious or controversial provisions. We also have the opportunities to make petitions and submit memoranda on whatever issue that you think should be considered by either House of Parliament to the clerk of either house for their consideration. And as I mentioned previously, where they fail repeatedly, because like there had been previous petitions for them to enact, for instance, the two-thirds gender rule, and where Parliament failed repeatedly to consider those views, then we also have the other channel of going to the judiciary to seek redress for this. So that would be my input into that, and I'll just request Kwame to come in and add any thoughts that you have on the questions that have been asked.
All right. Thanks a lot. I don't remember the second question, but I remember the first, which was about from Daisy about a rogue parliament and what. So let me say this first. I think that we should avoid the thinking that there's a perfect set of people who would form better parliamentarians than we have. I also think we should avoid the thinking that there are savior people out here, and I've seen people mention names. Some are people we've known, some are not, who look like nice people. They wouldn't be thieves and stuff like that. That is okay, but in my view, and I think my colleague stresses, creating a good constitutional order and maintaining a constitutional order requires permanent vigilance from all people. And so I think for many of the people who have led us to where we are today, it is a deficit of oversight by Parliament and its institutions, not the individuals in it. Of course, some individual parliamentarians are poorly behaved. Many of them should be in jail. But the point I'm trying to make is, I am not a believer that if you take one bad person and fix in a priest, for instance, your bishop or a religious leader, that would make Parliament by itself perform better. In my view, I think we need to actually educate ourselves as Kenyans what a presidential system requires. A presidential system does not have anything called the opposition, which I hear many Kenyans say, where is the opposition and where are they quiet, or they're too loud, or they're not cooperating. The real opposition in a presidential system is Parliament itself, checking executive power. So that's one. And the mechanisms through which you check executive power are mostly because Parliament, as my colleagues mentioned eloquently, holds the power of the purse. And the purse is money. And the power of the purse, I think they stress this, but I should stress again, the power of the purse for Parliament is nearly absolute because it comes in two forms. If you read at section 94, which was told to us, Parliament approves the appropriation bill. In the public finance matter, so which is two sides. So you approve where the spending would go to. And by approving where the spending would go to, you're even approving it by program. So you can actually tell, are we buying this? Are we employing this number of teachers, this number of doctors and all that? It is that detailed. So why parliamentarians are not prepared to go to that detail to do that check is something we can ask ourselves. And the second is they also check taxation power. So in other words, they're in full control of the purse because they talk about, they approve what goes out and they determine what comes in. It is not the president's money. When you hear some people speak, including people in the executive, want to give you the impression that the money belongs to the president and Parliament should just be a minor inconvenience. It's actually the reverse. And in my view, Kenya's Parliament, notwithstanding they're having committees paid handsomely or well, have not been prepared to go toe-to-toe with the executive on the question of financial control. So I think that's just basically it. Every year we have people who are spending public money, including some senators who we Nairobi people like, we know them. They wear fund suits, are spending 25 billion shillings of Kenyan money, and the Senate calls them and they don't come. And the Senate takes it. So basically, all those powers are there. So whether it's a question of party loyalty or not, I do not know. Or maybe it's not enough to say that, because you don't require, quote unquote, an opposition party to check a president. Parliament in itself should be. Why? Because Parliament's fast masters are you and I, who woke up at 3 a.m. Some people do not sleep to vote for them. So that's it. Now that's the way to think about it. So I'd rather those institutional checks worked. We have these antecedents of a Westminster type government, which makes the impression that the budget is actually owned by the executive. Because in the Westminster parliamentary system, quote unquote, when people say government, they mean the executive, because the executive and comes from parliamentary power. So it's not supposed to be like that. It's supposed to be separate. And I think it's insufficient preparation or willingness by parliament to actually go toe-to-toe. They've gone toe-to-toe with the executive in many places and got the CDF, which they're expanding, and the courts went back there, and then they colluded again. And now they call it national government CDF, but they all know, as Leo told us, that if they pass a bigger budget, they get more money for their patrol. So once we really need to separate parliament entirely from any execution of spending, whether as patrons or any other thing, and their only work should be oversight. Passing legislation, oversight, and representation. Nothing there says they should do anything in coordination with the national government. So that answers the first question about it, Daisy. So I don't know that we actually require more. In my view, the constitutional tools and laws are already in place. The parliament needs to perform its role. So for instance, by rejecting and asking for the withdrawal of Finance Bill 2024, the president is actually cleaning up for parliament because they've done a poor job, and all of us, or at least those who went to the streets, are protesting. So in my view, that there is no bigger signal that the speaker and all these other people who lead parliament have failed than the president having to do the cleanup job for them. And so in my view, I'm not even placing pressure on the president about what he thinks about budgets. The point is the people we need to persuade that these budgets are unpopular and these sums are unpopular are parliament itself. So that one. I think the second question was on
to what extent is the crisis driven by the demands by our lenders?
Yes. Now, so let me start for this. As a person who pays my tax, and I was just looking at it, I'm sure most of you looked at it. Of course, you sent your taxes by Sunday, so that on Monday you received your receipt from the Kenya Revenue Authority. And when you looked at it, and I looked at the public budgets, and the IEA has an analysis and fact sheet. Perhaps Michelle could place the link to the fact sheet that we prepared up there. Look, the entire program that started in 2021 between the IMF and the government of Kenya was for about $3 billion, right? $3 billion. The government of Kenya spends close to $36 billion in a year. The $3 billion program is for 4 years. So even if you slice it equally over 4 years, and I mean, it doesn't necessarily go that neatly, it's about $750 million per year. $750 million per year of spending is less than 2 weeks of revenue for the government of Kenya, even without the new finance bill, right? So when somebody says that somebody who's giving you money to support financial solvency of the government, but also stability, has that much power, I do not believe it. I don't believe it. So that's first. Second, if you look at the cadre of people we have, and in IMF operations, there are 2 offices that they call the authorities. It is an agreement that is agreed and signed by both sides because it's negotiated between the Treasury, held by the CS, and I don't think we've ever had a more qualified CS than that today, for 2 reasons. One, few Kenyans have had the privilege of leading both the central bank, serving a full term, and thereafter being elected, or rather being nominated and leading the Treasury. Our CS for Treasury is not lacking of academic or the credentials that are required to manage a Treasury. Then we have the central bank governor. Those 2 are called the authorities. So usually the agreement between IMF and the authorities are principally the agreement between the IMF and the people who actually represent Kenya on the IMF executive board. Remember, the people that are being negotiated within Kenya are actually, the director of the IMF is actually a staff. The IMF as an institution has members, and the executive board, which makes decisions, including making the decisions that Moshaya referred to earlier here, are constituted of finance ministers and cabinet secretaries for finance. Finance ministers or cabinet secretaries for the treasury and governors of the central bank. Both our cabinet secretary and the governor of the central bank for the Republic of Kenya today have served in the treasury, and so they should know their work. So to tell me that a peer of theirs coming from the IMF would come here and intimidate them to sign this is just wishful thinking. And we are giving ourselves a crutch as Kenyans for excuses. Now, is the IMF program perfect? Far from it. In fact, we at the IE are doing an analysis and we'll be issuing we'll be doing a launch in a couple of weeks about what we think is wrong with the analysis. So either they get it wrong or they do not do the political work about selling what it is that is required. But I'm not prepared to sit here and say I'm responsible Kenyan, thinking that the IMF imposed some medicine on us. What is known is the IMF has certain preferences, as my two colleagues have stated it. They prefer that in a condition where a government has this structural problem, you raise taxes. And they usually tell you, you raise taxes and we'll only fund you to ensure that you make these changes. So we fund this amount and you guys put in this amount. So I am not too sure. And if you look at politically in the last few years, those who analyze politically, use a international political economy lens, are actually saying that the IMF professions are actually losing power to authorities in the states, that actually countries tend to actually get a little bit more than it. And if you look at our Kenya's own report card over the last 4 years, there are many instances in which, yes, the program is going on, but there are things that the government promised that it has not done, but the program proceeds nevertheless. So in my view, I think this is perhaps more a dance of equals. It might be in the political preference of government of Kenya when they have to put in difficult changes to say that the IMF has commanded us. But there's no reason why Parliament should accept that just because the IMF has commanded. So in my view, we need to look a little bit more internally, as my colleague Jacqueline mentioned, than to actually blame the IMF for it. Because there's nothing in terms of credentials, knowledge of the Kenyan economy that an IMF person would have that I don't think our governor of the central bank today, the cabinet secretary in the treasury, and the big band of their colleagues who have more PhDs. We at the IEA say that the biggest economics faculty in this country is actually the central bank and the treasury. If they haven't done well in terms analyzing, well, faculty is bad in where you can rank them, but that's not to say that somebody from the IMF is holding a gun to their heads and forcing them to do a structural adjustment program. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Kwame, for that response. I think we must conclude now. We had intended to wrap up by 12:30. Actually, this ended up being a much longer conversation, but I think we can all understand why. It's been very useful to have this discussion. Before I close, I see one more hand up, but I don't know. I think Lillian, this might be your previous hand up. Do you still have a question, or was this from the first time? Lillian, did we answer your question?
Oh, yes, you did.
Okay, all right. So thanks. So I think I'll just ask Leo now to make your closing remarks and maybe respond to, I see Mushai has made some additional comments. If there's anything you'd like to, if you agree, because it's not necessarily a question. So Mushai says, I think Kenyans are fed up with waste. I agree, but less clear about the size of the state. There's also a broader awareness of the link between taxes, government funds, and corruption. That's our money you're stealing. Some of the Gen Zs ask, as we've seen in circulation, it's actually for higher spend on salaries and reintroduction of government programs. And then he concludes by saying that I don't think the information here is necessarily new. It's a question of the interest and political will. So Leo, as you respond to this, please make your closing remarks so that I can conclude. We can conclude in the next 3 to 4 minutes. Thanks.
Yeah, so thank you. So as I wind up, I agree that the West and the kind of political system, the kind of political rhetoric that Kenya, politicians have kept up with, is something that has finally come to that scrutiny. That scrutiny is something that finally Kenyans have started to look beyond now political realms, but are now focusing on directly at issues. The reason why it's very interesting for us is because these protests confirms our theory that the claim on property rights is a claim on economic liberties, and when those are infringed, it's very easy for the society to form what we call the collective action, and that collective action is now more broader, and it could actually mean uh, whether we milk that to obtain tangible reforms that can keep sustainable public finances, so that we don't go on a spending binge like the one we had in the previous year, is something to observe. So I wind up at that. The presentation will be available. We'll try and follow up with a brief. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Leo. So I will not. I think I agree fully with those remarks, and also just to add that we very much welcome that broader awareness that you've talked about, public awareness in terms of taxes, government funds, corruption, the seeing even the Gen Z discuss from a point of evidence showing that we know. I don't know if some of you saw those banners circulating generated by this agency regarding, for instance, what a watch worn by one of the cabinet secretaries costing a certain amount. What does it mean for a health facility in a certain village or a dispensary somewhere? What does it mean for supply of drugs and so on? So that kind of evidence-based discussion, I think we all agree is, and that literacy is increasing, which is very welcome. And I think all of us are very eager to monitor what will happen between now and next year, because we can only expect that they may suggest to bring in another finance bill. Of course, they will next year, but they'll be very we hope that they'll be reflective of the things that they suggest there. We hope that conversation, the public discourse will be meaningful before then, and will sort of inform like more informed proposals. So as we wind up, we are very grateful